You have to figure out how to hold people accountable if you want to lead at scale. And all of us
Mm.
do, founders or otherwise. We all that if you can figure out the accountability part of leadership, you will not be able to scale, and you're going to create bad situations, whether you try to be in the details or not.
Today's guest is Camille Fournier. Camille is one of the giants of our industry. She has been in tech for more than 20 years, has been CTO and executive at many successful companies, and she is an accomplished author. She wrote The Manager's Path, possibly the most influential book ever about engineering management, and has a new book coming out this fall about platform engineering. With Camille, we talked about good versus bad management, the controversial new founder mode, and career advice for managers. So let's dive right into it after a short word from our sponsor. Chances are you know of engineering metrics programs that didn't get adopted or failed to deliver the promised productivity gains. But why? Because those metrics live in dashboards, and dashboards die on the vine. They were built for a purpose, then people just forget about them. Sleuth Pulse solves this by bringing metrics and people together and powering engineering reviews across your organization. Sprint reviews, monthly check ins, and resource planning are all examples of common reviews in engineering teams that help you achieve alignment and successful execution. They are truly the best way to make metrics part of the workflow. So Sleuth uplevels them by bringing in quantitative and qualitative data, letting people add context, and using AI to summarize data and pick out outliers. Check out sleuth.io for more information. Hi, Camille. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Camille, you are an extremely accomplished tech executive, former CTO at different companies. You're also an author. You have written The Manager's Path, and you also have a book coming out this fall about platform engineering. And first of all, I want to say that The Manager's Path, I think, was the first book I have ever read specifically about engineering management that gave me a sound mental model about what good management, a good engineering management look like. And it was incredibly useful for me as a young manager and young co-founder and CTO, actually. So first of all, thank you so much for that.
Oh, I'm so glad it was helpful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start exactly from there because, as you know, this new essay from Paul Graham that came out just a few weeks ago called Founder Mode, which kind of challenges exactly this idea of what good management looks like. So to summarize, it describes there's this kind of bad manager culture where teams become black boxes. You assign managers, you manage through outcomes, and you stay out of details. You as a founder or you as an executive. And Paul Graham says this doesn't work and proposes this quote unquote founder mode without going really into the details of what this look like. But it's about doing the things, he says, that founders can do, which managers can't, apparently. So I know you have replied to that. You have written a great Medium post. So what do you think about this? Does this founder mode exist? Is it aspirational? Is it misguided?
So I mean, look, as you said, it's really kind of vibes, right? The
Mm,
post is very much like I don't like the post. I think the idea of dichotomies of like you are either in founder mode or manager mode,
yeah.
it's very simplistic, right? And of course the world is never that way. I have worked at massive companies where I would say that large parts of the companies were not run in whatever the sort of model of quote unquote manager mode
Yeah.
that was sort of the straw man put in that blog post, right? So I
Mm,
think already to me it's a little bit of like a flawed premise because
mm,
I'm just not I it's not that I don't believe that there are people who make the mistake of trying to find the algorithm for running their company. I actually was thinking about this topic, and preparing for our conversation, and I do think that one of the challenges you see, particularly with technical, executives and leaders, is that they want the algorithm to
mm,
tell them how to like lead tell them to do things, right? I'm a technical person, right? You learn algorithms in school. You learn, the steps and
Yeah.
instructions that you need to create to make something happen, right? And
Yeah.
if you write a computer program with the right steps and instructions, it will reliably do what you need it to do, right? Assuming it doesn't have any bugs, it will reliably do that thing. You can predict from the input what the output will be. Great. Okay. Um, Leadership is not that. And so I absolutely do agree that, if you think that there's an algorithm whereby you hire good people and you treat their teams like black boxes, and you, the founder, I don't know actually what the founder is doing in this case. I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
being a figurehead. I think he's absolutely right that that's not going to end up well for you, right?
Yeah.
It may not be because the executives are all these sort of malicious liars, as the post implied, or but someone does have to have kind of a strategy and driving force to move the company forward. What I don't agree with, though, is like that the driving force is therefore you want to be in the weeds of all of the details and all of the decisions
Yeah.
everywhere. Because I think that, one point that I would make about that is I actually think you train people to do the exact thing he talks about being bad, which is you train people to manage up to you and lie to you and
Yeah.
otherwise, like, tell you incomplete stories about what's happening
Yeah.
when you treat them in this way of like not trusting them and kind of micromanaging everything that they do.
Yeah.
I actually think that kind of behavior ironically creates the worst situation that you're trying to avoid, right? That's
Yeah.
not to say that, so I don't think you should avoid, understanding what's going on and being in details where appropriate. I also don't think you should micromanage to the nth degree all of the time, because I think smart executives learn how to manage up from leaders like that who exist everywhere. They are not just founders, right? We see them all over every
Yeah.
company has some of those people, and they teach people how to manage up to them because nobody wants to be micromanaged. And so smart, capable people are just going to figure out how to feed you the information that they know you want to see in the format that you really respond to, and they're going
Yeah.
to use that to hide the stuff that you don't want to see. And you can think that you're smart enough to outwit them and figure out what's going on. And sometimes that's probably true, but it's not always going to be true. And it will be less and less true the farther away they are from your area of expertise. So you have to figure out what I definitely disagree about is don't just manage by outputs. You have to figure out how to hold people accountable, if you want to lead at scale. All of us
Mm.
do, founders or otherwise. We all that if you can figure out the accountability part of leadership, you will not be able to scale, and you're going to create bad situations whether you try to be in the details or not.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, like I totally agree that there's no algorithm. You can't just, you know, hire people and trust them to do the right thing and expect that good things will happen. I think engineering leadership also makes that mistake sometimes, right? Hire smart people, get out of their way, let them build whatever they think is right. I've worked at a lot of companies on a lot of teams where that was an approach for a while. And did you get a few good things out of it? Absolutely. But, maybe for every one great thing you got from that sort of free form model, you got 10 things that actually were not great and maybe even slowed the company down because of the
Mm.
approach that the engineers took or the time that they spent on that instead of actually growing the business, right?
Yeah.
So, we've got to have balance. Um, we've got to have balance. A founder mode is a catchy term. It's definitely not going to go away. It's way too catchy to go away. But if the founders are listening to this conversation, what I would encourage you to remember is, um, it is absolutely correct that like you can't take your hands off of your business, um, and for a long time, most likely, right? Eventually, if you're very successful, right, you will retire, you will hand the business over to
Yeah.
someone else. You'll probably be sad about what happens because like it was your baby. I'm sure Bill Gates probably sometimes looks at Microsoft and is like, oh my god, what happened to my baby? But like whatever, like that's going to happen unless you want to like run the business until you die. Eventually if your business is successful, eventually you're going to have to let it go. And if you're lucky, you'll hire a Satya Nadella, or somebody eventually
Yeah.
will, like a Satya Nadella will come over, and they will change the business in totally new ways that maybe you never would have thought of, but that make it even better and stronger for the future, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it is absolutely appropriate for you to be involved in your business, for you
Yeah.
to be a leader, for you to make decisions, sometimes unpopular decisions. That is not the same. That is not, but that is not a that's not a pithy thing, and that doesn't mean you don't need strong executives and good managers to have a successful company. That merely means this isn't actually a formulaic process, right?
Yeah.
So, get over the idea that there's a formula you can use to solve, company success.
Yeah, and I think that's where things get a little bit confusing for many people, because it's one of those cases where it seems like one side of the advice is fine and the counter advice is fine as well. Like maybe the best example for this is the legacy and myth of Steve Jobs, that was this kind of famous micromanager, apparently getting into all the details. But if you listen to his interviews, he all the time literally says, hire great people and let them tell you what to do. So these are apparently like two opposite views. So makes me think you have to stay like in the weeds, but there are maybe good weeds and bad weeds to stay into. But how should you navigate that if you're an executive or a founder? Does that depend on your strengths, your aptitude, or the people you work with?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things. I think that, yes, like you are probably unique in some aptitude.
Mm,
I worked for Rent the Runway. I was the CTO at Rent the Runway, and the CEO, still CEO, the founder there, Jen Hyman, was a very unique individual. She was one of the most brilliant product strategists and marketers I've ever seen, and she would go in and out of kind of being in the weeds of those areas, and I'm sure she kind of drove all of us crazy in the process, as happens, frankly. But at the time, I was still a new executive. I was still learning how any of this should work, and it would be very frustrating. I think I got overly frustrated often about it because, frankly, when the CEO comes in and she decides that you're going to do something completely different and you're going to take the business in a different way, you're like, what the heck? Like, we have all these ideas. It's going to be very disruptive to my team. They're already working on all these other things that they care about and that I've
yeah.
sold them on. And now you expect me to change everything. And that can be very frustrating. But I think, in retrospect, what I see is like she, most of the time when she had those ideas, she was right. And it was her business. And she was the visionary leader behind that business. And so I think she was absolutely right in making and being willing to make hard, not always internally popular product pivots in order to ultimately make the company successful.
Hmm.
So I think as a founder, you've got to figure out what your thing is. Like, what is the genius that you have brought to this business where you just have that clarity of view. And that is probably some aspect of the product or the marketing or the whatever, as well as possibly the culture, right? So I think the
Yeah.
culture is the other side of that can kind of go either way. I think there was a Bill O'Reilly post from a while ago that Brian Cantrell linked to, and when he was talking about founder modes. If you Google
Mm,
Brian Cantrell, Brian with a Y, he wrote a post about founder mode, and he links to an O'Reilly post where O'Reilly himself talks about a lot of the things he did well and he didn't do well in sort of the early to middle days of O'Reilly and growing that company. And I think that's actually a great example of what founder mode really means, and places where he's like, I should have stayed more in the details of the company culture and handbook as we sort of turned into a proper company with an HR department and a legal department and all of that, right?
yeah.
Versus areas where he was like, I was not an expert, and I think finance was as an example. And instead of trying to force myself to become a finance expert, for so long, I just wasted a lot of time where I could have just really delegated that to the great people that I hired, and they would actually figure out how to make this business more efficient in those ways. right?
Yeah.
So I just think you should figure out, I think it is very realistic and good to stay deeply involved in the things that are your area of genius. You should also always, though, be challenging yourself. Like, if the company has grown and scaled 10x, are you still actually like really able to be a genius at the 10x of this particular X, Y, or Z? Maybe, maybe
Yeah.
not, right? You may need to learn some new things. But delegate, but then you have to be willing to get out of your comfort zone and figure out how to hold people accountable for those things that you delegate. So
Yeah.
there's no world where you get to get out of the hard work of like thinking about things that you probably find kind of boring
Yeah.
occasionally. Right? We all find something kind of boring occasionally. And if you're leading people that do that thing, you don't have to, you can delegate a lot of it to them, but you have to pay some attention unless it's totally unimportant. And then you may ask yourself, why are we doing it at all? If it's really this unimportant, should we outsource it? Should we buy a product to do it for us? Should we whatever, right? Like, unless it's a philosophical, I don't think HR is important, which I'm sorry you're wrong about that. But like, generally speaking, like, for the major important functions of your business, you need to pay enough attention to understand how to manage them effectively from an accountability perspective.
Yeah.
And that can be boring sometimes, but that's like founder life is not all glamour and doing the cool stuff.
Yeah, love this take. So basically, find your own area of genius where you can contribute, probably long term, whatever the scale, or maybe something changes with scale, but it's what makes you special as a founder, probably from the times even when you were a small company, and you still contribute to that and find those other areas where you should delegate and delegate well. And that's hard work. Anyway, it's not that it's easy to do that. I love this take. And I want to get back to what you said before, that we are often guilty of trying to find algorithms to do everything. We are all engineers. So we see a problem like scaling a company, scaling an organization, and we want to find the formula that works in every case. And do you think that we are guilty of that when it comes to this topic, scaling an organization? And maybe that's why we are seeing this kind of backlash maybe against this management structures that we have got from big tech. That's one of the reasons why maybe the Paul Graham's article made such a splash in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's I do totally agree that what I agree most strongly with, even though I think it is like I don't love to like stereotype and scapegoat people as much as possible, but like I do agree that there are absolutely, you know, sharks out there at
Mm,
the executive level that, you know, they just want to do what they want to do. And they are very political. They are very good at managing up. They are very
mm,
good at making it seem like they are doing good things while doing very bad things. And you see them everywhere. I don't think I've ever worked at a company where there haven't been a few of these folks somewhere, right?
mm, mm, mm,
Um, and but I don't, if you're like the problem is, so I don't think the problem is like that we're inheriting a bunch of stuff from big tech. But if you're hiring senior executives from big tech, you are more likely, I think, to get those people just
mm.
because like you really have to learn that skill to be successful at really big companies.
Yeah.
Not everybody got successful because of that, but like I do think that at big companies there's so much politics just inevitable at
Mm,
scale, that there are absolutely people who are just, they got to where they are by being very good at, making friends with the right people or saying the right thing, or sometimes just like outrunning their mistakes. I definitely think there are a lot of executives out there who like do a really good job for, a couple of years, and then they move on to the next thing and they leave behind a giant mess that like, a few people knew about, but a lot of people didn't know about. And they just kind of, I think there are genuinely a lot of
yeah.
those types kind of running around. Um, So I don't think like I don't actually think that the I think that you go to a big company, there are big company things you have to learn how to do, like complex processes maybe for like performance reviews or like fancy business review type processes that could be useful in a small company or may just be overhead and bureaucracy in a small company. And I do
Yeah.
think anytime you hire like a manager from a big company, you need to make sure they aren't just trying to like copy paste the things that worked in that context into your world. Which, by the way, is actually true kind of anytime you move from one company to another. There are inevitably going to be slight differences in the context that will make some of the things you did at the last company work and some of them not really fit. But big company to small does have that big risk of like, I think it's
Mm,
really not about like managers so much as just like bringing in unnecessary bureaucracy that just
yeah.
doesn't serve you.
Yeah. But so do you think that this bureaucracy is necessary for smaller company, but it's a necessary evil in bigger company? Or do you think that given, I don't know, advances in tooling, productivity, what we know about good management maybe today, the classical management model of big tech companies is a little bit bloated. Maybe we're seeing more layoffs and companies still going fine even with less people.
I don't know actually. Like I don't know that tech companies I don't know enough of the actual details of like
Mm,
what the spans of control and blah 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 look like in
yeah.
big tech companies to have a smart opinion because a lot of big companies still have they actually seem to have like both ends of the problem. You have too many situations where you have somebody managing two or three people, which
Yeah.
if it's a transitionary period where somebody, you're growing a team or you're sort of growing a new manager and it's kind of you're teaching them kind of the ropes for a short period of time, maybe that's fine. And I think that's the challenge at a big company. You're going to see that all the time because there's always this sort of shifts and growth and changes. But if that's like a strong habit in your company where you have lots and lots and lots of managers who are managing two or three people, um, you've got something of a problem. On the other hand, you also almost always see people where they have way too many direct reports, where it's like, oh, this person has 20 direct reports, they've got 25 direct reports, and you're just like, there's no way they're managing those people effectively. Like you just
Yeah.
can't at that scale. Maybe if they're all contractors, it's a little bit of a different thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if you're Jensen Wang, the NVIDIA CEO, right? That's just a completely different world. If you are managing executives, totally different world than managing even just like senior managers, let alone individual contributors or line managers. These are
Yeah,
just
he
different.
said because I think you mentioned to the interview where he said he has like 40 direct reports, Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, and
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
taking him as an example of what a middle manager maybe should look like.
Like he should like he that's just not he's not he's the friggin' CEO of
Yeah,
CEO and founder of NVIDIA. That's he is very successful. That does not mean that is the lesson to take away from his success. Maybe the lesson
yeah,
to take away from his success is if you are a founder of like a massively quickly growing company, hire really, really amazing people to your leadership team so that you're not really worrying
yeah.
about like
To babysit them. Yeah,
layers and whatever, and you don't need to have one-on-ones with them. You don't need to do that stuff. That's just like those people have a very different job than almost anyone else. When you are in that level of senior management, your job is very different. I have worked for senior managers in that kind of position. Their job is very different than even my job, right? And so I think that the problem is not that big tech is bloated. The problem, because I think big tech can be both bloated and, completely poorly laid out, right? Both of
yeah,
those are not really successful ways of like sort of setting up management. But I think the real thing that you need to worry about is not as much like do we have too many managers? It's again, are we creating too many unnecessary processes? Are we creating a lot of unnecessary overhead? Are
yeah.
we, you know, are we trying to do like too many really elaborate like project management, things like, agile plus plus double double extra, right? Where,
Yeah.
if you look across your teams and like all of your engineers are just in meetings all the time, yeah, you for sure have a problem. I don't know what it is, but you for sure have a problem if your engineers are in meetings all the time. Sometimes that problem is that engineers all feel like the only way for them to get anything done is to talk to 20 people, right? Sometimes you are causing the problem because you can't agree on a direction
Yeah.
with your peers or with the product team or whatever. And so people are just getting thrashed in a million different directions. And they want to write code, but they can't because no one agrees what needs to be done. And every time they try to make forward progress, they get shot down. They end up in some morass of approvals that just never ends, right? So yes, pay attention to your bureaucracy. Please pay attention to your bureaucracy. That is one of the most important things you can do if you want to stay in founder mode or just be a successful company, is like constantly evaluate the processes and ways of working and ask yourself, do we need this extra approval? Do we need this meeting? Do we need this, you know, if you are in a highly regulated business, as I most recently have been, the answer may very well be yes. Actually, we kind of have to. But you can always ask, like, could we automate it? How could we lower the burden of this necessary process as much as possible? Even though we're a giant company, we're operating in Europe, we have these data residency requirements that require these kinds of sign-offs. Like, how do we make that as painless as possible, despite the necessity of doing it?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Because I think it's been really fascinating to see the kind of response, sometimes even emotional response, maybe attached to Paul Graham's piece for such a, let's say, high level, not to say vogue piece, right? And made me really think. And one angle is the one that you mentioned, also about bureaucracy, about maybe big companies versus small companies. But I think there's also another angle that is more about identity and culture. Probably there. I mean, I've written about this even in the past. It feels to me there's this kind of divide between companies who are, hustlers, all in the same room, long hours, Silicon Valley type, and companies that are instead more calm, remote first, thoughtful, and everyone thinks bad things about the other. Either it's lazy or it's unhealthy on one side or the other side. And I think that these kind of pieces, founder mode, get easily hijacked by these parties for to push this kind of culture or agenda. I don't know if we can bridge the gap, or it's just a cultural thing that appeals to different types of people, and companies can function well in either case. I don't know if you see any of these and if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I definitely agree with what you're sort of seeing. And I do think, like, look, you're never going to perfectly bridge these kinds of gaps. There's always going to be, if you have a successful business, you can, you can, and you probably will do it however you want, right? So if you
Mm.
have a successful business that's relatively calm, and I've seen some of those, right?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily remote first, but sometimes they are. Um, and you've got a successful business. It's probably not a giant company. I actually find that while there are plenty of like calm people at giant companies, most giant companies are not calm. There are a lot of like real hustlers at every big company, whether you work with them much or not. Sometimes you just have to be a hustler to get anything done, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think, I do think that like a lot of you see the Silicon Valley hustler company, partly because just to start a new business requires some amount of hustle no matter what,
Yeah.
right? And,
Yeah.
so unless you're sort of in that kind of lifestyle business that somehow maybe you manage to take a lifestyle business and really just like go big with it, or you decide consciously once the company gets to a certain size to adjust the culture in certain ways and and calm it down maybe a little bit.
Mm.
But I think you see hustlers at calm companies and calm people at hustler companies. Um, but at the same time, like you're absolutely right. There is an identity war.
Yeah.
And and I mean, I guess it's okay, right? Like I kind of think that I kind of think that we would all do well to like try not to demonize one another
Yeah.
and and totally stereotype one another. Because I just don't think I think most of the time that just doesn't really go anywhere positive for us, for the world. Like
It's true.
I'm sort of sick of it. I'm sort of sick of it. I think we all kind of got into it for a while there. And the more I work, the more people I work with, the more different types of cultures that I work in. I do learn a lot about myself. Because like I'm like a calm hustler. Like I'm, I think I'm actually pretty thoughtful. I don't tend to be one of those people that's like, in the office 12 hours a day. Um, but I work very hard and I think about work all the time and I want to win. I want to be I want to like be around success and creating success. So, it's like I am myself and like I'm not really one or the other. I'm sort of like
Yeah.
this weird, and I'm not saying that to be like, oh, I'm like awesome. Like I actually, frankly, I think sometimes I'm like, man, I wish I had more like stamina to work longer hours sometimes. Or, I wish I could shut off more, frankly. Like I don't love remote work. Like I'll do it a little bit, but like I'm not the greatest. I love to see people in person. And that, that like quiet contemplation time of remote work sometimes makes me like a
Yeah.
little jittery. So, so it's like I think I am like a person. I think I'm a human being. I think
Yeah.
we're actually all human beings and it's hard to put us, in one bucket or another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's on one side it's not black or white, on the other side it's not helpful to bucket ourselves, into these strict categories because we are all a blend, and it doesn't take us, closer to one another, but it just fuels wars and conflicts, and it doesn't do good, I think. And we have talked about management, we talk about trends, while management is usually the domain of timeless advice, right? I mean, we have incredible management books that are like 40 to 50 years old. And I remember when I read The Manager's Path, some of the best lessons I learned were about things that were not even technical, right? So things that are expected of you, like communication, feedback, adaptability, and more. But do you think that has anything changed instead? Do you think if you think about today, 2024, is there anything that you would write differently, for example, to give advice to engineering managers? And mind you, I mean, no is a perfectly acceptable answer.
Yeah. So I have to make the admission that like I haven't read The Manager's Path all the way through, probably since right about when I published it, because if you ever write a book, you will realize like how
Yeah,
sick you get of your book by the time it's actually published. The one so there are two things to say here. One is that um, most of the things I wrote in that book, and often when I come back to it for reference, I'm going to, talk to
yeah.
someone about some specific part of it. I think, wow, I don't know, I was smart. Like,
Back then, yes.
I actually often think, oh man, my editors were really helpful when I wrote this. Like, I sound really good, but I think I had a lot of
Did I
editorial.
did I write myself this? Yes.
um, but I think a lot of it, like I still believe a lot of it. I think that a lot of it is still useful.
Mhm.
I'm actually, what's been very interesting to me is I wrote The Manager's Path um, right after kind of having grown through the management ranks, frankly, very quickly. This is something that I'm only starting to kind of admit when I talk about it now, which is that like now that the book I think has settled into frankly being way more successful than I ever expected it to be. I'm just blown away, but I'm also like so proud of myself to be honest. But now that it's settled in, like the truth of the matter is I had not been managing for very long when I wrote that book. Like this is not a book of someone with 20 years of management experience putting all of their wisdom. This is a book of somebody who had grown very quickly as a manager in a very high stress, high pressure situation, mostly in startup, um, and who just wanted to get all of the things that she had learned, through the rapid kind of trial and error that you can have when you work at a startup on the page, right?
Yeah.
That plus a lot of, I have an amazing network of friends who were also had gone through that. Maybe they had gone through it a couple of times and, who also, sort of helped me, and we would talk about these topics a lot. But this was a book that was written, kind of very fresh. It was very
Yeah.
fresh experience for me. I think that's the only way I ever could have written it. I actually think, once you've been doing it for so long, you forget what is novel and important and that people need to learn because you've just been doing it for so long. It's like you have to someone has to ask you specifically before you think, oh yeah, that's not something that everybody just knows how to do because they've been,
Yeah.
they've been doing one-on-ones 10 times a week for 15 years, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, I forget that can be hard
Yeah.
for people to do that. um, so I wrote that book. 7 years have passed. I've been managing, frankly, much larger teams since then. I've managed, 100, 200, 800, like very, very large organizations. Um, and I think there are additional things that I have learned about managing at that kind of scale. But I think almost everything I wrote in the manager's path still kind of stands up. Like it's all useful stuff. The one thing I'm not as sure about is actually the stuff that I wrote about interviewing managers. That I may rewrite. I might change. That's probably the only thing that I can think of that I'm very clear about. Like I'm not totally sure because I hadn't hired that many managers when I wrote it, and I think that now I'm not, I actually think hiring managers is much more about the culture of the company that you're hiring them into. And like, there's just a lot of nuance to that doesn't come out quite as well in the book. Um, but what I will say is, so I don't think that there's a lot that I would change about the manager's path. I have learned a lot since then. And a lot of that actually is in my new book, which is about platform engineering. Um, Yes, it is about like a specific type of, it's really for engineering and people and technical and product
Yeah.
leaders. Sort of it's a book that's aimed at leaders, not necessarily managers, but people in
Hmm.
kind of leadership positions. But it's a book about like how do you make this platform engineering thing kind of
Yeah.
work at scale, which is what I have been really focused on since I wrote The Manager's Path and moved on in my career. And so on the one hand, it is a little bit specific about that type of engineering and that type of engineering and product leadership. But on the other hand, it actually there's a lot that you need to learn about scaled leadership that comes through in that book. So about, leading product teams, or working with product teams or doing sort of thinking in a product mindset, a lot about like, hiring different types of roles, dealing stakeholder management is actually a
Yeah.
big part of it, right? Running and executing long running complex projects where you need to explain what your team is delivering. It doesn't perfectly translate to what, product or application engineering, which is where you really have something that's a little bit more externally facing to clients or customers
Yeah.
or whatever, or you're working very, very directly with the business. Whereas I think platform engineering, a lot of what we're talking about there is like the internal technology that you build to support the engineering teams at your company and create kind of that leverage for more sort of internal developer and application engineer productivity. But there's a lot that is in fact still kind of general leadership lessons about more scale, like thinking about these kinds of things more at scale.
This is so interesting. Both the idea of the additional learnings that got into the new book, and also the fact that you said that maybe the fact that you were more fresh into this very fast career when you wrote the first book was even an asset. In writing the book, this kind of naivety maybe, and you were unburdened with respect from someone who had been like 25 years in the industry, maybe. And I mean, I remember it made me think that I founded a startup in the travel space when I was very young. I didn't know anything about that. And one of my investors told me this thing that if I had known anything about the industry, I would probably have never started this. And instead I could bring this kind of ingenuity And it's is this what you meant? It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah, no, I just think sometimes the best time to write is when it's just really fresh,
Yeah,
and sometimes you need to marinate, right?
yeah,
But I think I do like to write things when they're really fresh because I can still feel them. I feel, for
yeah.
me, a lot of like writing, I have to feel a strong opinion about something before I'm
Mm,
willing to like put, fingers to keyboard and like write about it. Because if I don't have a strong opinion about how something should be done, like who am I to tell you? Like I don't know, do
yeah.
it a different way, right? But when I feel strongly about something, and usually I feel most strongly when it's very fresh for me.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a great litmus test for what great writing looks like. I mean, I write a newsletter full time, and you develop your kind of instinct about what when an article is going well, is going to do well, and when it's not going to do well. And many times it boils down to, is this opinionated? I mean, may other people really disagree vehemently with that? And if they don't, probably it's not good enough. I mean, you're not really putting yourself out there. And I mean, that's how it works for me sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right, and it is scary to do that,
Yes,
right?
it
And
is.
that's the other thing is like the longer you stay in management, frankly, the more you have to kind of temper that big opinion. Like you
Yeah,
will have them occasionally, but like the more senior you are, the more your job to is not to dominate everybody with your opinions all the time, but
yeah,
rather to like nudge and guide and
yeah,
be open-minded to the ways that they want to do things. Because again, it's back to that founder mode thing. Like you got to be very choosy about the things that you're going to be really opinionated about, and you should have some opinions. Like, don't get me wrong, even if you're not a founder, right? If you're a leader, part of a great leadership, I think, is to you know, being willing to stand your ground on the things that really matter to you.
hmm,
But if you want to do that, you got to let the stuff that doesn't matter, like you've got to be much more willing to be nuanced and subtle and ultimately like let people make mistakes on the stuff that you're not as sure about or maybe that doesn't matter as much to you.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely agree. So I want to shift a little bit the perspective to focus more. We have talked about management, to talk a little bit more about individual managers and people who may be listening to this chat. Because this is, of course, a period of transition. There have been layoffs. There's this trend of companies running leaner, managers getting, unfortunately, more direct, so getting more technical. And we've even run a survey on the newsletter about well-being and how people feel about their work. And something that we discovered is that managers have more trouble in visualizing their impact and figure out what they're bringing to the table with respect to ICs many times. So what's your advice for engineering managers who want to stay valuable, and how they should think about their career, and how to prove your value? I know it's a very broad question, but do you have any tips?
Yeah, I mean it's broad and it is tough, right? Like I
Yeah,
sometimes struggle with this, it's like, oh my God, like what do I tell people I did? Right?
yeah,
I managed 800 people. You don't really do the work,
yeah,
right? All these brilliant people who were working, in the teams that worked for me, they did all the work. Like what did I do? What was the point of me? And you do like so. I feel all of you
exactly.
who have that existential angst about what is it that I do. So I'm going to give like kind of a meta answer, um, which is not a great answer because I need to think about this more to give you a really good one. But a lot of a lot of how you stay valuable is that people want to work with you. So first, as a manager, people want to work for you, right? If
Mm,
people don't want to work for you, if you can't hire good people, if you hire good people and they constantly quit, um, you know, that is not, that's not great, right? You're never going to be the right manager for everyone. I've worked with some great people who I don't think would want to work for me again, and we like each other as human beings, but like we're not a good match, right? But
yeah,
ultimately, like number one, people have to want to work for you. You have to be seen as a credible leader. And I do think that depending on what kind of thing you do, for me, a big part of that um, is that I do stay like technical-ish in that like I can ask people really good questions about what they're doing and often understand what they say to me. And so for a lot, because I work in pretty heavily technical areas, people like that, right? Like people like that I actually seemed like I understand and appreciate their work. People need to want to work for you. People need to want to secondarily work with you.
Mm,
So you need to play nicely with your peers. This is one where I think more senior people often fail. If you're constantly like, that team should work for me, that manager is a bozo, like there's always going to be one or two of bozos around you,
for
right?
real?
That
Yeah.
they'll think of. But like a lot of the time, like if you are constantly in conflict with your peers or with the product team or with the DevOps team or whatever, right? You got a problem, right? So being a good collaborator is a second part of staying valuable, because if people like you and your team and want to work with you and your team, you are showing value. And a lot of value as managers is kind of this meta, is vibes, right? Because of
Mm,
course number 3 is people want you to work for them, right? So
yeah.
unless you're the CEO or the founder, you have a boss, right? You have a boss. You may have you have layers of bosses above you, right? If people if people see you and see your abilities and they're like, "Ooh, I'd love to have that person, you know, leading my team. I'd love to have them." You know that you're doing well. And of course, that a little bit brings us back to manager mode, right? Some of that is like, how are you presenting what you're working on? How are you presenting
Yeah.
what your team has accomplished and making sure there's visibility, in that? How are you showing up at, when you're in meetings, when you're interacting with people, how do you show up? Are you engaged? If you're remote, is your camera on? I know people hate this, but like, I'm sorry, folks, you
Yeah.
gotta turn those cameras on. It is bad vibes to not be
Non-negotiable.
able to see people. Turn off
Yeah.
self view. Self view will make you insane. But like, leave like as much as possible, when it is, when it let, unless you've got like kids running crazy in the background or whatever, which I understand happens, it happens on occasion, like, be there, be engaged. I think the other thing that managers should remember, is that like, you are the company. You are a representative. You are a representative of the company. You can influence the company culture, but a lot of like the value and the expectations of you is like, are you if your boss says you have to do something, or if something has to happen, how good are you at driving that thing to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because if you are just constantly going to push back and cause trouble, and well, why do we have to do performance reviews? And by the way, I've been that person. So I totally sympathize. Like sometimes you're just like, this is stupid. This is a stupid process. We shouldn't do it this way. I've got way better ideas about how to do it. But I think the more senior you get and the more experience you get, you got to realize that like, it's not valuable to just like complain and say no. A valuable leader brings sort of thoughtfulness and to like, how can we make this thing that needs to happen go as well as it can, and maybe influence it to be better in the future.
Yeah, love this answer. I mean, I think you touched on so many great topics. First of all, I think it's reassuring to hear that this kind of anxiety, even about your contribution, your role, is totally normal at any level, even for the most accomplished leaders. And I loved also the angle about the fact that you have like two teams. You have the team of your direct reports, of your reports, and then you have your peers, which is like your second team, and you have to work well with both, which is two very different things, I think, at different scales of companies. And do you think that, I mean, this was all an angle about uh, your contribution to the team and to the company. Do you think there is something about your skills that you can work on. I mean, this is easier for ICs. You study things, languages, frameworks, but do managers have a way, to sharpen the saw, or if anything?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so first of all, I think that that whole like accountability thing we talked about earlier and
Yeah.
goal setting is really hard. It is
Mm.
it is super hard. I think you can spend your entire career as a manager figuring out how to help your team, your organization, your people, depending on what level you're at, like set good goals and measure them and learn from them
Yeah.
and accomplish them. And I mean, it's just hard. And it's going to require, you're probably going to play around with a bunch of different frameworks in the process of doing it, right? You might try OKRs. OKRs I'm generally a fan of OKRs, but they're hard. They're hard to do. The hardest part of OKRs is teaching people how to do them, and
Yeah.
they can take a long time to like get right and get the sort of muscle of doing that. So like thinking about how you set goals, how you figure out what's important to work on, at least for the kinds of teams that I lead, I actually think that is just an incredibly important skill. There may be times when that's not actually the most important skill for you to work on. There are definitely leaders in tech who get a lot of their goals externally, right? For better or worse, a lot of the goals come from, let's say, like the product lead is like, we've got to ship these things in this period of time, and you don't have as much like play with what you're doing. Um, then I think, then there's the skills of like, how am I making sure my organization is delivering optimally? And
Mm.
again, nobody has perfectly cracked that code. There's always work to be done there, right? What are the checks and balances? Do we have the right people? How do we know? How do we, what's the, are we building a good culture for collaborating with other teams that we have to work with or other roles that we have to work with. Um, I think, so I think the major skills of managers are really like goal setting and sort of organizational goal setting and accountability, and bleeding into like, how do we know that we're getting things done? How are we constantly challenging ourselves to do more and do better? And then of course, like all of that also requires like people who are inspired and wants to work with you, and you've got a good balance and you're thinking about things like diversity, which I think is still a very important thing. Like you can't just sweep that under the rug. I do think that you want to have, psychologically safe teams, which means you've got to figure out how to bring together different types of individuals and have them successfully and happily work together, right? And
Yeah.
feel like they have a career at this company, and sometimes you're going to have people that are not going to have a career at that company. And how do you handle those hard conversations? And so I think then there's just all of the many skills around, you know, people and talent and inspiring and leading those people and kind of bringing out the best of them above and beyond just sort of general efficiency and productivity. Um, and I do think like a lot of how you learn them is like you've got to challenge yourself to, you know, look outside of your own world, talk to managers other places, make friends externally, that are
Yeah.
managers, and hear about what they're doing and just stay curious, because like, look, you're going to read lots of things where you'll be like, oh my gosh, what is Paul Graham talking about this stupid founder mode thing? Like, and so you're going to read
Yeah.
things like that and you got to sit with the fact that it makes you uncomfortable and ask yourself, like, do I have a good reason for dismissing this or not? Like, is there a kernel of truth in this thing that I just heard about that I don't agree with that's worth like bringing in, even though I think most of it is wrong? Or, sometimes you'll read things like, oh my God, I never even thought about it that way, but that is amazing. And how can I start to bring some of that into me? There's a lot of skills. There's a lot of skills you can keep learning.
Yeah, love this. I think, first of all, it's a great checklist of areas that need constant work to be, kept in check. And I also totally agree about keeping a healthy network of peers outside of your company. I mean, if I think at other interviews we've done in the podcast, one of the most recurring ideas when people are asked about what has been the most impactful for their careers is having this kind of relationships with people from other companies to compare notes with and compare the things that they do the same as you and things to do differently, maybe because of themselves, because of the team, because of the company culture or whatever. And I think it's such a learning opportunity. So I wanted to keep the last few minutes to talk really about what you're doing right now, because I know you're moving on from your previous job and you have also the platform engineering book coming out this fall. You have briefly talked about this already. So what is going on and what is next for you?
Yeah, so I'm in a transitionary period. I have a book coming out on platform engineering that I mentioned earlier. I wrote this book with my former colleague of mine, Ian Noland, and I'm very interested to see how it will be received by the wider world. So I think platform engineering, which is sort of that discipline of building and operating internal platforms that kind of enable productivity and leverage for a business. I do think that it is sort of a topic that a lot of people are sort of talking about and around and defining and redefining. And
Yeah.
is it is an internal platform Kubernetes? Is it this? Is it that? Right? And I'm very passionate about like using technology to make people able to focus on what's important for them, and but also
Create
like,
leverage.
yeah, to create leverage, and but also to like, I'm also very passionate about doing that with a very high standards of operational excellence. I'm and building things that people actually want versus tech that you think would be cool or fun. So I am very interested to see how this is received by the industry. That is, platform engineering is what I love, is what I love doing. It's what I'm most excited about. And so as I am, sort of thinking about what's next for me, taking a little time off to kind of, get out about the book and do some, writing, I do think that I want to continue to work in that platform engineering space, either through, advising, consulting, or possibly at some point, going back and running another large, or, medium-sized team. Platform engineering is not something that like a tiny startup should be doing. I think it's a question we get a lot. This is not something that is for your 20-person startup, right? This is for you're getting to some amount of scale where you actually have, share problems that multiple engineering teams are kind of either all solving independently or stepping on each other's toes trying to solve. That you kind of need to think about how you pull that out and make that more of a shared function. So yeah, so that's what I'm up to, and so I'm definitely excited about what's going to be happening, but also open to hearing about opportunities from people. If anybody on this podcast is like, oh my gosh, Camille, we'd love to talk to you more about this in some way or another, I'm definitely reach out.
Really excited about the book and excited to discover what you will do next. So thank you so much, Camille, for this great chat. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.